Would you love to be able to play guitar like Eddie Van Halen, but you think it just seems a little out of reach for you, or like it would take forever to be able to play to that level? I believe you can actually do this surprisingly fast as long as you have a sound strategy and focus on the right things. Today I'm going to break down for you what those things are that I think you should focus on. Basically, I've got 1 don't, 3 do's, and later in this video I've got a special bonus strategy, so make sure you stick around for that. Alright, let's get into it. So first let's cover what you do not want to do. Now, my video is titled Play Like Eddie Van Halen Faster Than Everyone. Stop doing what everyone else is doing. Specifically, I would strongly caution you against trying to learn these songs, licks, and riffs with tab books and online tabs, which usually are just honestly rehashings of the tab books in the first place, which are riddled with errors throughout. Now, I will say, when I was a teenager and a younger guy, I did learn most of my Van Halen songs from those tab books. I mean, I didn't know any better at the time, and seemed like it was the fastest way for me to learn, even though, like, I always could tell something just seemed off about some of them. I mean, some of them were alright, like this Van Halen 1 book here. It's still one of the better ones, even though it's got plenty of errors in it. But there were so many other ones where I'd play some lick and it just was like, how can it flow and be so fluid sounding when he plays it, and this tab it just doesn't sound right. But then years later, when the light bulb finally came on, then it became evident that most of these books, they just have inaccuracies in them, and that's why the licks don't sound right when you play them, because they're not tabbed out the way they were played. So if instead you choose to learn from videos, you want to make sure as best as you can that the people in these videos aren't just teaching the same stuff that's already in these tabs. How would you go about doing that? I mean, I guess you'd have to look at the tabs and compare what's being taught in the video, but it doesn't do you any good to still learn the same mistakes. So what things do I recommend that you actually do? Some proactive steps. I can't stress enough how valuable it is to simply dig in and do your own research. With the classic Van Halen catalog, we're very fortunate that we have a lot of these songs available as isolated tracks, so you can hear just the guitar, which makes it so much easier to hear what he's actually doing. It's an incredibly valuable resource. I would listen to those. I would run the music through either a DAW or some kind of a music editing software. If you want to use a free one, Audacity is great. I use things like Transcribe, and in case if I can't find an isolated track, I also have this other app called Moises, which is an AI tool that does a pretty good job of separating out the instruments. So I'll use that if I can't find an isolated track. Definitely watch videos of Eddie himself. There's so much video available that you can, even with some of the crappier quality on some of the old stuff, you can still kind of see what he's doing. Like if it comes down to, if you're not sure what position he's playing a certain lick in. I'll tell you, like, it was an old video from the early 80s where I realized that every single tab out there for Running with the Devil has that simple verse riff wrong. Now I'm just talking about this one. They all have it going to this open A. I mean, it's the same notes, but I could see, I can't remember if it was US Festival or like the 1982 Buenos Aires show. I could distinctly see that he was playing with his pinky that A note. And initially I thought that that was really the only difference, but then when I got my hands on that isolated track, it turned out there were some other intricate things going on that were just not at all what the tab says. So that's just a very simple example. Then along the same lines, as far as doing research, you want to get acquainted with Eddie's favorite techniques, tricks, licks. I mean, as amazing of a player as he was, he's a human being too, and we all have our tendencies. And there's definitely certain positions and things like that he uses over and over again. He does repeat himself. I mean, not necessarily verbatim, but you can get a sense for what he's doing. He has his signature licks, and you'll start to recognize them the more you dig in. Obviously, another area you want to focus on is getting the right gear so that you can get close to the sound. So just for some basics, you're going to want an amp with some good gain. In a guitar with humbucker pickup, you only need one. And then as far as effects pedals, at the most basic level, it'd be good if you have a phaser or a phase 90, a flanger, a delay. Maybe you might want to add an EQ. He used EQ on the early records. That should cover most of the early work. Then, you maybe consider adding like a chorus, maybe a harmonizer, a wah pedal. You didn't really start using that until, I think, Cabo Wabo on OU812 was probably the first time he used that on a record. And if your amp doesn't have good gain, well, you'll have to get some kind of a distortion pedal. I've never owned a distortion pedal, so I can't really give too much advice on that, although my inclination would be to say, if I was going to go get one, I'd probably start with some kind of a Marshall simulated gain. I know there's so many distortion and gain pedals available on the market these days. All right, the next item on the do list, and I know this sounds like a daunting task probably for some folks, but I'm here to tell you it's not as bad as you may think. But I highly recommend do your own transcriptions. If nothing else, it's a great exercise. It'll help build your ear. And in this instance, if you're going to do your own transcriptions, one thing I would say is it can be helpful to use a pre-existing tab as just a starting point. Sometimes like a lot of the rhythmic part might be pretty accurate as far as the note subdivisions and things like that, even if all the positions and whatnot are kind of questionable. At the very least, you don't have to create all those measures from scratch. I mean, I've done this many times where I'll start with the tab even though I know it's not correct, but at least then all I have to do is go in and fix the things that I believe to be wrong. So that can be a bit of a time saver. And this is another place where if you make use of those, the isolated tracks, you can find them on YouTube pretty easily. I would definitely use that. The only drawback is then you're not going to have the drum beat to go against, so it can make it a little bit challenging, but like I'm familiar enough with the songs that it doesn't really faze me too much. But the big takeaway here is I really can't stress enough how beneficial this is, not just for learning these songs better, but just for your overall development as a musician and guitar player anyways. And if you just break it down into manageable pieces, it's really not that bad. I know the first song I ever transcribed by Van Halen was when their last album came out, A Different Kind of Truth. I absolutely just wanted to learn the song Out of Space like immediately, and I wasn't going to wait for the tab book. So I did it myself. It didn't take that long. I think it took about a week. But then they did make a tab book for it, and it came out, and I'm telling you, I know I'm a little biased, I hate to brag, but my tab is way better than the one that was in that book. I know that this is where knowing his tendencies can come into play, because there's this one part in the song where he does this lick. Well, not exactly like that, but he uses that descending tap where he kind of pedal tones on one fret. And they wrote it out some weird way where it was like all these different strings skipping, and I had to laugh when I saw that. I was like, nice try. And then a huge benefit and bonus you get from doing your own transcription, by the time you are done, you're almost going to not even have to practice the song. You're going to have much better retention, and you'll probably be pretty close to up to speed as far as being able to play it. You'll just learn it way more thoroughly. It really sinks in when you do your own transcribing. So once you have the right notes and you know how the licks should be played, that's where you want to practice them slowly and gradually increase the speed, unless you learned it really well while you were doing the transcription, assuming you did that. And when you're in this step, I definitely recommend playing along with the track, at least until you get comfortable with it, because this is going to help you really be able to replicate his rhythmic timing and feel. Outside of like straight eighth notes or 16th notes, there's, in some of the faster passages, there's a little bit of nuance to Eddie's timing that is part of what makes him sound the way he sounds. We've all got that element to a degree. It's part of the human experience, I think. If you slow anybody's, like, none of us are going to play something perfect. We're all going to be slightly imperfect to one degree or another. And it's like fingerprints. Like, we're all going to be a little bit less than perfect, but not in the same way. So when you practice along really slowly, it helps you to recreate his like rhythmic nuance, because you're getting more in tune and closer to how he's striking the note in relation to the beat of the song, if that makes sense, I hope. But you can lock into his timing, and then as you gradually speed it up, it'll sound more naturally like what you're used to hearing. Then I'd say once you have a good feel for the timing and the licks are under your fingers pretty well, and maybe it's time to start speeding things up just a little bit, then you maybe want to switch to just practicing with a backing track and not playing along to the guitar, because that'll help you hear any errors in your own playing better that way. And of course, isolate the more challenging parts and practice them as much as you need to get them down. But there's also always benefit in practicing the whole song all the way through too. Don't overlook that. All right, so that gets us through the one don't and the three do's. Well, I guess technically it was 2 do's and a practice. So that gets us to the bonus shortcut that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, which is simply that you could learn the material from someone else who has passionately already put in the time to do all the things that I just mentioned. I might be a little biased, but I would pick me. Now, I've been obsessed with learning Eddie's licks since I was about 14. So I've spent a significant amount of time poring over video, listening to isolated tracks. And I can't go into specifics on any of these steps in this video. It would take too long. I'll drill in on the details in future videos. In fact, I'll be doing one in the very near future about a lick that I learned that was an absolute light bulb moment for me, where it just flipped a switch in my brain, and that's where I realized, wow, these tab books are not good. I mean, they're better than nothing, but they missed the mark on a lot of what he does and how he does it, which, I can understand. They didn't have the tools back then that we have now, so I don't mean to bag on these guys. In this book, for example, I mean, Wolf Marshall has an amazingly insightful introduction, and he calls out a lot of Eddie's techniques, and he calls them out, pretty well. But then when it comes to the actual transcription, there's spots where he kind of missed the mark, and it's like, dude, you know what the tendencies are, and you missed this one. Anyway, if you want to see an example of my work, I highly recommend my lesson series on how to play Runnin' with the Devil. Just like it is on the record, I can confidently say they're the most accurate version available. I mean, there's the main riff. I throw in a little detail that I don't see anybody else talking about, and then I have the verse riff played properly, as I briefly demonstrated earlier. So I hope this video provided some value for you and some insight, and I hope you leave it with a little more confidence going forward if you want to be able to play like Eddie Van Halen, my favorite guitar player of all time. So thanks for watching, and I hope I'll see you on the next video. See ya.